Disgraced pop star and convicted paedophile Garry Glitter is awaiting a parole board decision on whether he can be released from prison, ladies and gentlemen.
His parole hearing came on the same day a man who killed a young woman in a drunken speedboat crash before going on the run was released. Jack Shepherd had served half of a 10-year sentence for offences including gross negligence manslaughter of Charlotte Brown.
Joining us now is criminal solicitor Joseph Kotrie-Monson. Joseph, I hope I've got that right. I want to ask you, and I want to stay as calm as possible, something that men and women, the length and breadth of this country, would like a straight answer to, and I'm not blaming you for this. How is it that we have a system that says to somebody as vile as Glitter, you've raped children, you're going to jail for 16 years, and we find ourselves as a society that says, oh, by the way, after 8, we'll let him out on tag and he can spend the rest of his time rehabilitating when our probation service is on its knees and he's still a danger. People are so angry about this, Joseph.
OK, well, there's a few things in there, Jeremy. Good morning to listeners and viewers. Well, I think, first of all, this is not a question for the parole board. When you are talking about early release, these are rules that are laid down by Parliament. And the question for the public is, well, you have politicians, they enact laws based on policies that a manifesto that you vote for. And if you want to see change, that's where you should direct your ire, not to lawyers, certainly not to the parole board. There is a principle with regard to bringing people out of prison after a certain period of time, but they're subject to very strict rules and they must be assessed for risk. So it's wrong with respect to say that, for example, if somebody is still a risk, they're still let out. That is the only consideration for the parole board. But there is a tendency, and I have to say it's one that I'm sympathetic to because I can see it myself, Jeremy, and it's circumstances where you think, this crime was so awful, this crime was so odious, they are being let out early. Those are not considerations for the parole board. You can't conflate the issue of risk, which is the only consideration for the parole board, and just how horrible these crimes were. If these crimes weren't horrible, these people would be going to prison. They wouldn't be going to prison in the first place.
Yeah. Joseph, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So the parole board process, can you just in the most basic terms break it down for us? When they're trying to assess risk, how do they do that?
OK, well, first of all, and this is probably part of the problem as far as people looking at it from the outside, these are processes that have or proceedings that happen in private. And you think, well, hang on, justice should be seen to be done, shouldn't it? We should know what's going on. And it makes people confused. It makes people very angry. And that's very understandable. The reason they're in private is because it's very sensitive. Witnesses have to give evidence, often victims who don't want to do it in public. And of course, also, they don't want to necessarily relive through the newspapers what's going on. That's changed slightly. They can be in public if all parties have been listened to and if it's in the interest of justice. But in terms of the process, considerations about risk, well, they will look at things like the age of the offender, the process that they've been through. You know, there's I think, a really big difference between a case like Garry Glitter, multiple sexual offences, terrible sexual offences over a period of time, calculating convictions abroad for similar offences in Far Eastern countries, whatever. And for example, a crazy act of a young man, which I'm not justifying, I'm not too careful to do that, but a crazy act of a young man that is characterized not just by callousness and, a disrespect for other people, but also immaturity. I actually think that perhaps in that case, one can see a universe in which the parole board might have thought, well, this was a very, very terrible and irresponsible act relating to this just infuriatingly.
Joseph, I agree in part with you, and I understand, and I want to thank you because there is anger, certainly, about Glitter, and I know you're in no way defending. You're answering our questions about the system. I want to say two things to you about the parole board. You say to me it's very important it's done privately. We had Richard Scorer on yesterday on this show who represented one of the victims whose sole wish was to read her. I read this morning. I spoke to Richard yesterday. Her sole wish as a woman who was raped, at 12, was to read her witness statement and look her perpetrator in the eyes. something the parole board said no. Now, you talk about what's right, and some victims won't want to do that. The parole board that you're talking about, that we should have faith in, released Garry Glitter after 8 years. And within 6 weeks, he was back in jail for surfing the dark web and being filmed by a newspaper who did a fantastic job, by the way, looking for child images. I would respectfully suggest that when they let him out after 8 years, that's why the British public are losing faith in a parole board system and are angry.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on there. And yeah, you're right. I'm very sympathetic with that point of view. I think, first of all, I think the rights of people to be able to attend in those hearings and those hearings to be public, where there is unanimity, are very important. But of course, in that case, multiple victims. And there's that overriding concern that that decision about assessing risk must come first because of the ongoing danger to the public. That is even more important than the rights of victims to be able to hear themselves, because you can't have somebody going out who may commit something again. Of course, you're right. In Glitter's case, he was recalled immediately. I'd actually say that that's probably a success of what happens when, in terms of the way license works, because he wasn't recalled for a similar type of offence. He was recalled for something that indicated that he may have committed a lesser offence, and you can be recalled not on the basis of having gone through a trial, but a mere hint of it. And in cases like that, especially where it's high profile because of the seriousness of the offences, you're under intense police supervision and observation. And I have to say, the way... Pardon?
It didn't work because he was surfing the net for images of children.
Well, I think actually in that case, it was a reported conversation he'd had with an inmate inside, or I don't know the exact circumstances, but rather than having been caught in the act of doing it.
I just think that, and again, I really appreciate you being on, because it's good to have this conversation, because it's very emotional. It's something that I feel really strongly about. I know people feel strongly about, and they don't. I mean, I would throw away the key. I'm sorry, and I'll have that argument with anybody. Anybody who's got a child, to think that this man has any degree of liberty is beyond me. Joseph, you've always been straight with us and being straight with you. We also have reports of Kari Abdul Rao. This is the so-called ringleader in the Rochdale grooming scandal that for some reason has been quashed in the media for years. I'll let you all speculate on that. He, defended by you, everybody is worth a defence. I want to ask you this. Is still living in the same area of some of the victims, has not been deported, was found guilty, and he's been released with you defending him. Can you please explain to the British people why we're allowing a man, a paedophile groomer, a ringleader, to still be roaming the streets? Because that's the thing that winds the heck out of people.
No, absolutely. OK, well, first of all, I should make a small clarification. My firm were involved in the trials. I didn't represent that defendant. Certainly don't represent
I do apologise. That's what it said here. I do apologise,
no, that's
Joseph.
fine. That's fine. But I can speak to the position.
Yeah.
My understanding of that case, having done a bit of reading on it, is it relates to various circumstances to do with primarily delay. These are proceedings that have been ongoing for a great deal of time.
Yeah.
And, you know, deportation proceedings, for example, the court backlogs, etc. I mean, it's the bane of our lives as lawyers. What's happened is the justice system has been bled of funds since kind of the 2008, 9, 10 austerity period. And of course, people think, well, we don't need to pay for legal aid. We don't need to pay for courts because that's just criminals. No, that is what affects our communities in these types of circumstances with these atrocious delays.
Really, and I mean this, really, really good to have you on. Really interesting to get an angle on it, Joseph. Thank you so much for coming on Talk today. Thank you, my friend.
What I think was useful learning there is that the parole board are not looking at how odious the crimes were that someone committed, but to what extent they believe there is a risk that the person is going to offend again.
I'm not sure.
Maybe that's a misconception.
I know, but I'm not quite sure how 3 men or women can sit and go, Garry Glitter raped 12-year-old girls. He's OK now. I mean, we might have a different view, and that's important in life, but I, as a father of soon-to-be 6, I don't want him on our streets. I believe that there are certain crimes, Rosie, that take away your right to liberty.
I think the point Joseph's making is that is not the job of the parole board.
No.
That's a sentencing issue, and then that comes down to our
But my point about the
politicians.
sentencing is if you want him to serve 16 years, you're going to have to give him 32, aren't you?
Well, yeah, that's a fair point.
That's the statute book, right?
Joseph, thank you so much.
Yeah.